Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my downstairs basement office from my home. Usually on Sundays, I stay home, and so you'll really only see my office at school if you come by to see me, usually on Tuesdays and Thursdays, definitely between 3:30 and 6. Otherwise, you're pretty much going to see my home offices on these weekly videos. We are headed into week 3, and that means that we are starting on chapter 2 in your book. Now, one or two of you still don't have the book, and that's okay. I want you to take some deep breaths and not worry for a couple of reasons. Number one, I know we're getting them to you. And number two, these lectures will be good enough for now until you get the book. And when you see the book, you'll see that these chapters are relatively short and very, very clear. And so that means that I'm probably going to be putting up another reading assignment this week. So be on the lookout for that. You will get an announcement email when I do that. So don't worry about missing it. And we also will probably have a Blackboard discussion assignment this week. So I wanted to make those, make you aware of those two things and to be on the lookout. But again, you will get announcement emails if I put it up an extra reading assignment or an extra discussion board assignment. Don't worry. It's not something that has to be done overnight. So you're still doing this course on your own time for the most part. But I thought that for those of you who like to keep a really good schedule, I would stay on schedule by moving us into chapter 2 of the book. And it looks like it's a lot more complicated than it is. So this video is going to seem incredibly short, despite what looks like a very complicated chapter. And that's because it's not as complicated as they're kind of making it sound. So bear with me on that. Let's start with a little background. I'm going to take us back to COM 209. If you can stretch your brains back to whenever you took that, I'm sure it's been a year or maybe 2.5 for some of you. But in the beginning of that course, especially if you took it with Dr. Collins, I know for sure this happened, you're usually introduced to sort of the main paradigms of the way that we study communication phenomenon. If it's still not coming to you as to what those 4 paradigms are, I'm going to give them to you. The first is sort of a post-positivistic or positivistic paradigm where we believe that we can study phenomenon, or I should say, phenomena, from the perspective of science and biological responses. So very empirical. So what can we know with our senses about this phenomenon that we're looking at? And basically that's it. So you're looking at the scientific method, okay? Very deductive in structure, very strict in its rules. Then the second paradigm would be the interpretive paradigm. This is the paradigm that's sometimes called humanistic. It's where we're looking for essentially building consensus about the meaning of certain phenomena. So, for example, if I'm studying a communication phenomenon, like let's say I'm looking at an interaction between two people and I want to study their argumentation strategies, I can do that a couple of ways, but the best way might be to sit down with an interpretive approach and have them interact with me as the researcher and then draw conclusions about that. And so essentially what we're doing is as we collect data through sort of qualitative methods of interviews and focus groups and so on, we get themes. In other words, we're looking for consensus on what the truth probably is. And that's sort of the interpretive perspective. The third one is, generally speaking, the rhetorical perspective, where we are looking mostly at persuasive techniques that move a mass audience. So this is about mass influence, is what it's about. And most of the time that's just one person, not necessarily trying to build consensus amongst a group of people about something, but rather looking at a communication phenomenon and saying, based on everything we know about what's going on around and within this phenomenon, that we can make the following conclusions. So it's usually one individual sort of advocating for one perspective, okay? The last and certainly not least that I'm going to talk about is the critical perspective. And in the critical perspective, we are looking mainly at power relationships. power relationships that get created, maintained, or debunked, dismantled through communication phenomenon. This mostly has to deal with groups too, and how we identify and whether or not we are empowered by the identification or whether or not we're part of the system that is oppressive in some way. So we're always looking at the power relationships that are created, not just by who's talking to whom, but also by what language is being used, what assumptions we make from that, and really digging through a communication phenomenon in order to understand the power relationships. So hopefully that very brief review sort of trips your mind a little bit to what you studied in COM 209. The reason I bring that up is because chapter 2 is literally called Social Movements as Interpretive Systems. So I thought, well, we might want to talk about what they mean by that. And what do you study a social movement as if not an interpretive system? So let's break this down a little bit. They break it into two parts. I'm probably going to break it down a little bit further for you. So the first thing we need to know is how would you study the communication of a social movement if you didn't study it as an interpretive piece of communication, of interpretive phenomenon? What would you do? And the answer is you would study it from sort of a functional approach, or what they used to call a systems approach, really. And that approach basically says, look, here are the rules of the game. Here's what a social movement looks like. Here's what it needs to do in order to be successful. And it talks about all of the moving parts of a social movement, not necessarily the communication going on within it and from it to a larger audience. So it's really focused on here's a black box. I'm going to input my social movement. It's going to either meet the criteria or not meet the criteria. And on the other side, we're going to spit out an answer as to whether or not it's successful or not. And most of the time, social movements aren't that easy to evaluate. They're very complex. And so we do look at them from a systems perspective. That is to say, how does it function as a system in of itself? Okay, so a movement is very separate from other systems. The hierarchies are different. The leadership is different. The strategies they employ, heck, the goals are different. So what do we mean then if we're going to study it from an interpretive perspective? Well, the first thing that we need to do is think about interpretive methods of understanding a social movement. So what are the persuasive tools that are being used? How are we building consensus among the members of the social movement? How do we evaluate success? It's not necessarily by the number of people that are reached or the number of people that report being affected by something. So we need to have multiple people look at how a social movement is working or not working in order to make it better, or to sustain it in some way. That's an interpretive approach. Now, the next part talks about systems specifically, okay? Now, an interpretivist perspective, an interpretive system means that you're looking at the organization as a system, but you're not looking for the moving parts and how they work together or don't work together. Instead, you're looking at interpreting the entire system, whether it's being successful or if it's failing somewhere, and trying to understand that. I'm going to be 100% brutally honest with you right now. I have never found this approach to social movements, a systems approach of any kind, I've never found it to be super useful. There's just too many things that we don't know. If you're looking at a communication phenomenon like, say, for example, a manifesto that a social movement puts out, that's pretty easy. There's words on a page or, on your computer, and you're able to tell what they're doing exactly in what order and what might or might not be working for them, what's a good argument, what's not a good argument, right? And certainly from the rhetorical perspective, that's the case. So If you want me to do more than that and look at all of the moving parts from an interpretive perspective, that could be very difficult because now I need to bring in everyone who's involved in this movement, not just the artifacts that the movement puts out or the goals that the artifact is trying to achieve or that the movement's trying to achieve, or what the mission statement is trying to do. Now I've got to bring in how everybody in the movement looks at those things. And that could get extremely complex and difficult and, let's face it, ungangly in trying to study it. Now, there are some good things in this chapter. I'm going to highlight for you the things that I want you to really know. I want you to understand that there is a difference between a communication process, a communication network, and a communication system. Okay, so that is what they're trying to do there, is teach you those things. Then in the second half, they talk about studying social movements as interpretive systems. And here they give you a list of questions, which in a book, a textbook especially, excuse me, goodness, I'm sorry. In a textbook especially, I don't like seeing questions. I want answers. So hopefully some of those are provided. But the ones that we are most interested in is, how do people define themselves as part of or outside of a movement? Okay, so that's really, I think, the that starts on page 41 according to, I'm just looking at the index here. That starts on page 41. So I want you to focus on that when you get to that part. So it's not that the other parts aren't important, they are, but as far as what do you need to focus on in the text, those are the things you need to focus on to really, for us just to move into the next step, which chapter 3 is persuasive functions of social movements. And that's going to be a lot more interesting. We're going to be looking at particular theories and how we're going to study a movement. So, like I said, this video was going to be super short. I've given you just a few things to focus on in the book. For those of you who don't have it yet, it's on its way to you. And, next week, the persuasive functions of social movements, that's going to be a lot more work for you. You're going to need to read that one very, very carefully. So if you want to go ahead and get started on chapter 3, you can do that. In the meantime, keep a lookout just in case I do put up another reading and a discussion board assignment. Most likely we'll do both, just so you know. I'm not usually this sort of wishy-washy about it. Most likely you will get both of those. So letting you know that those announcements will come out in plenty of time for you to do the assignments. And just so you know, you do not need the textbook to do this discussion board assignment. This particular discussion board assignment does not require the textbook. So you'll be able to do it whether you have the textbook or not. So I don't want you to worry about that part of it. Things are still just kind of getting rolling. I don't know about you. I can't believe that we're in the 3rd week already. But this is your video for the 3rd week. And I will see you next week for sure. And I will be posting some things for you over the next day or so. So keep a lookout. I will talk to you all soon.